Michelle Carter adjusted the stiff collar of her pilot's uniform and smoothed her freshly ironed pants as she stepped into the bustling terminal of Atlanta International Airport. This was the moment she had dreamed about her entire life, her first flight as captain. Yet, as she walked through the corridors, her nerves were on edge. Not because of the flight, but because of the whispers, glances, and subtle looks of disbelief. She was used to it. "Excuse me, ma'am. This area is for flight crew only," a young attendant at the entrance of the VIP lounge said, looking her up and down with skepticism. Michelle offered a small, professional smile. "I am crew." The attendant blinked, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Are you with the cleaning staff?" "No," Michelle said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm the captain of Flight 247, departing for London. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to get through." The attendant's mouth opened slightly, her eyes darting to Michelle's uniform, then to the ID badge clipped neatly to her blazer. "Oh," she mumbled, stepping aside. "I'm sorry about that." Michelle didn't dignify the moment with further acknowledgement. She had bigger things to focus on, but the interaction left a sour taste in her mouth. As she entered the lounge reserved for the flight crew and passengers of first class, the atmosphere didn't improve. Conversations quieted and heads turned. A well-dressed woman in a beige trench coat whispered loudly to her husband, "She can't be the captain." "That must be a mistake." Michelle's sharp ears caught every word, but she kept walking. A crew member, First Officer Ryan McAllister, stood near the coffee station, giving her a hesitant wave. Ryan was young, ambitious, and still green compared to Michelle's years in the industry. He seemed a bit unsure of her, though she suspected it had more to do with her authority than her gender or race. "Captain Carter," he said, attempting to appear relaxed but failing miserably. "Big day? You could say that," Michelle replied coolly, extending her hand. Ryan shook it awkwardly. "I overheard some passengers talking," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "A couple of them seem skeptical." Michelle's eyes narrowed slightly. "Skeptical?" Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, first-class types. They don't exactly keep their opinions quiet." Michelle sighed internally, but kept her face neutral. "Well, they'll have their opinions. My job is to get them to London safely, not to make them comfortable with the idea of a black woman flying the plane." Ryan looked a bit taken aback, but nodded. "Of course, Captain." As boarding began, Michelle took her place at the gate entrance, greeting passengers as they entered the aircraft. "Welcome aboard, Flight 247, she said, her voice crisp and professional. Most passengers responded politely, though a few glanced at her nameplate or uniform with poorly disguised surprise. One man, dressed in a sleek gray suit, paused in front of her. His brow furrowed as he stared at her badge. "Captain, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "That's correct," Michelle replied, her gaze steady. The man smirked and leaned toward his companion. "Well, let's hope we make it to London in one piece." Michelle felt her chest tighten, but her expression didn't waver. She stepped aside, letting him pass, and reminded herself to focus on the task at hand. Once the passengers were seated, Michelle and Ryan prepared for departure. In the cockpit, Ryan fidgeted nervously. "Everything's looking good," he said, double-checking the pre-flight checklist. "Good," Michelle replied, her tone clipped. She knew he meant well, but she could feel his unease. Before takeoff, Michelle addressed the passengers over the intercom. Her voice carried through the cabin, calm and confident. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Michelle Carter speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 247, nonstop service from Atlanta to London. We're expecting smooth skies, and we'll be cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet. Thank you for choosing to fly with us today. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey." In the first-class cabin, heads turned. "That's her? She's the captain?" The woman in the beige trench coat whispered to her husband again, her voice tinged with incredulity. Her husband shrugged. "What difference does it make? If she's qualified, I just didn't expect." The woman trailed off, her discomfort obvious. A younger passenger, sitting nearby, chimed in. "She sounds professional. What's the problem?" The woman gave a tight smile. "No problem, of course. It's just unusual." Back in the cockpit, Michelle focused on the task at hand. The hum of the engines, the methodical process of takeoff, and the feel of the controls in her hands brought her a sense of calm. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Michelle couldn't help but think of her father. She had been only 8 years old when he first took her to an air show, his large, calloused hand holding hers tightly as they watched planes roar across the sky. "Someday, Mickey," he had said, using her childhood nickname, "you'll be up there. You'll fly higher than I ever could." His voice echoed in her mind as she leveled the aircraft and set the course for London. "Smooth climb," Ryan said, breaking the silence. "Indeed," Michelle replied, her lips curving into a small smile. As the flight progressed, the cabin settled into its rhythm. The murmurs of passengers gave way to the steady hum of engines. Michelle knew the flight wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was about challenging perceptions. What she didn't expect was just how personal the challenge would feel today. Michelle adjusted her headset as she listened to air traffic control, her voice calm as she confirmed their cruising altitude. Despite the serene skies outside, tension simmered beneath the surface. "Captain Carter," Ryan said hesitantly, breaking the silence. "Mind if I ask you something personal?" Michelle glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Depends on what it is." He hesitated, then chuckled nervously. "How do you deal with it? You know, the comments?" Michelle leaned back slightly, her hands steady on the controls. "I don't deal with it. I focus on doing my job. The rest isn't worth my energy." Ryan nodded slowly, but his face betrayed lingering uncertainty. Before he could respond, the intercom from the cabin buzzed. "Captain, this is Dana and the cabin crew," a voice crackled. Michelle pressed the button. "Go ahead, Dana." "Just a heads up, we've got a situation with a first-class passenger," Dana said, her voice cautious. She's making comments about your qualifications." Michelle sighed, her grip on the radio tightening slightly. "What kind of comments?" "She's saying she doesn't feel safe with you flying the plane," Dana admitted. "She's asking to speak with someone about reconsidering the flight crew." There was a brief silence as Michelle processed this. Ryan glanced at her, clearly uncomfortable, but said nothing. "Thanks for letting me know," Michelle replied, her voice controlled. "I'll handle it after the flight. Just reassure her that everything is under control." "Will do, Captain," Dana said, signing off. Michelle leaned back in her seat, exhaling through her nose. "Unbelievable," Ryan muttered. "She's really questioning whether you can do the job after you got us up here safely?" "It's not new," Michelle said with a shrug. "Let them talk. The plane will still land in London regardless of their opinions." But her composed exterior belied the tight, not forming in her chest. In the first-class cabin, Dana approached the woman in the beige trench coat, who had now crossed her arms and was speaking in hushed but urgent tones to the man next to her. "I've flown with this airline for 20 years, the woman was saying, her voice carrying just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I've never seen anything like this. It's not about her being a woman, but it's definitely about her being a woman," a younger passenger interrupted from across the aisle. He had removed his headphones, clearly fed up. "What? You think she's not capable because she doesn't fit your little stereotype of a pilot?" The woman stiffened, her cheeks reddening. "Excuse me, I was having a private conversation." "Private? You're loud enough for the whole cabin to hear," he shot back. Dana cleared her throat. "Ma'am, I understand you have concerns. I assure you, Captain Carter is one of the most qualified pilots in our fleet. You're in excellent hands." The woman huffed, refusing to meet Dana's eyes. "I just think it's unusual. That's all I'm saying." Dana's voice grew firmer. "Our airline doesn't tolerate discrimination in any form. If you have a legitimate concern, you're welcome to file a report after the flight. For now, please refrain from making comments that disturb other passengers." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. Her husband, looking increasingly embarrassed, mumbled, "Let it go, Linda." Back in the cockpit, Michelle's mind raced as she tried to shake off the situation. She focused on the navigation panel, forcing herself to stay centered. "I know you don't want to hear this," Ryan said cautiously, "but you're handling this better than I would. Is that supposed to be a compliment?" Michelle asked, quirking a brow. Ryan chuckled nervously. "I mean it. I've only been co-piloting for a couple of years, and I've never seen anyone deal with this kind of pressure, so calmly, years of practice, Michelle said simply, her tone neutral. Ryan hesitated again, then ventured. Did you always know this was what you wanted to do? Michelle glanced at him briefly before turning her gaze back to the horizon. Since I was a kid, my dad worked on planes. He was a mechanic. He wanted to be a pilot, but life didn't give him the chance. Ryan nodded, sensing the weight in her words. Sounds like he inspired you. He did, Michelle said softly. He used to say, Mickey, if you're going to fly, you fly higher than anyone expects. You show them. Ryan smiled faintly. Sounds like a great guy. He was, Michelle said, a flicker of emotion crossing her face before she masked it again. Later in the flight, Michelle stepped out of the cockpit for a brief stretch. She walked down the aisle, her strides confident despite the tension. As she passed the first-class cabin, several passengers avoided her gaze. The woman in the beige trench coat, Linda, looked up sharply. Her eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though she might say something. Michelle met her gaze head-on, her expression unflinching. Linda's mouth closed, and she turned away, pretending to adjust her blanket. A middle-aged man sitting in the row behind her raised his glass slightly as Michelle passed. Nice work up there, Captain, he said warmly. Michelle allowed herself a small smile. Thank you. As she made her way back to the cockpit, she overheard a snippet of conversation from the younger passenger who had defended her earlier. She's probably more qualified than half the guys flying planes, he was saying. People need to wake up and stop judging people by what they look like. Michelle didn't stop walking, but a faint sense of validation settled over her. Back in the cockpit, Michelle slid into her seat and adjusted her headset. Ryan looked up from the controls. Everything okay out there? He asked. Same as usual, she replied, her voice even. Ryan hesitated, then said, I think your dad would be proud. You're showing them, just like he said. Michelle's lips twitched into a small, genuine smile. Thanks, Ryan. For a brief moment, the weight lifted. She was in her element, commanding the skies. No amount of prejudice or judgment could take that away from her. The cockpit was quiet except for the steady hum of the engines. Michelle monitored the instruments with precision, her mind clear and focused, though the knot in her stomach remained. She had faced countless moments like this in her career, but today felt different. Ryan, she said, breaking the silence, you ever think about why people doubt others so quickly? Ryan glanced at her, surprised by the question. Honestly, I think it's fear. People are afraid of what they don't understand or what challenges their worldview. Michelle nodded thoughtfully. Fear. She let the word linger. Fear shouldn't be what keeps someone out of the sky. My father used to say the skies are the one place where everyone is equal. No barriers. Just you and the horizon. Ryan opened his mouth to reply, but the intercom buzzed again. Captain, this is Dana in the cabin. Michelle pressed the button. Go ahead. Sorry to bother you again, but the passenger in 3A is escalating. She's demanding to speak to someone about being unsafe. Michelle's jaw tightened. I see. I'll come out and address it myself. Are you sure, Captain? Dana asked hesitantly. We can handle her. It's fine. I'll be there in a moment. Ryan shifted uneasily as Michelle removed her headset and stood. You don't have to do this, Captain. Yes, I do, Michelle said firmly. Because people like her don't just stop. They need to see that they're wrong. The first-class cabin quieted as Michelle walked in. Linda, the woman in 3A, sat with her arms crossed, her expression defiant. Her husband looked mortified, staring at his hands. Ma'am, Michelle began, her voice calm but commanding. I understand you have concerns. Linda raised her chin, her eyes narrowing. I don't feel safe with you flying this plane. I don't think you're qualified. A murmur rippled through the cabin. The younger passenger from earlier leaned forward, his jaw tightening, but Michelle raised a hand, signaling for silence. Ma'am, Michelle said evenly, I've been flying for over a decade. I've logged thousands of hours, passed every required test, and I'm certified by one of the most rigorous training programs in the world. My qualifications are not up for debate. Linda huffed. It's not personal. I just think... Michelle's voice sharpened slightly, cutting through Linda's sentence. It is personal, ma'am. When you question my ability without knowing anything about me, it says more about your assumptions than it does about my skills. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Linda faltered, her face reddening, but she didn't respond. Michelle straightened. My job is to get you to London safely, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Now, if there's nothing else, I suggest you relax and enjoy the flight. With that, Michelle turned and walked back to the cockpit, her posture rigid but composed. As she passed, several passengers murmured words of encouragement. You tell her, Captain, the younger man said, offering her a nod of respect. Back in the cockpit, Michelle exhaled slowly as she took her seat. Ryan glanced at her, his admiration clear. I don't know how you do it, he said. Stay so composed. You have to, Michelle replied. If I let every comment like that get to me, I wouldn't have made it this far. Ryan hesitated. Was it always like this? Even when you were starting out? Michelle leaned back, her eyes distant. Worse, actually. My first year in flight school, I was the only black woman in the program. I had people telling me I didn't belong from day one. Seriously? Ryan asked, his brow furrowing. Michelle nodded. One instructor said I should stick to something easier. Another made me redo a test 3 times because he didn't believe I'd passed fairly. But my father, he kept pushing me. He said, Mickey, every barrier you break makes it easier for the next person. She paused, her voice softening. He didn't get to live to see me in this seat, but I think he'd be proud. Ryan nodded, clearly moved. I think so too. The flight continued smoothly, but Michelle couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The weight of Linda's words lingered, stirring up memories she thought she'd buried. As she checked the flight instruments, a thought struck her. She reached in her flight bag, pulling out the old manual she'd carried since her first year as a pilot. It was battered and worn, filled with notes and highlighted sections. Something wrong? Ryan asked, noticing her distraction. No, Michelle said, her fingers brushing the edges of the pages. Just remembering, she opened the manual, flipping through it absent-mindedly. A small piece of paper fluttered out, landing on the console. Michelle froze, staring at it. What's that? Ryan asked. Michelle picked up the paper with trembling hands. It was a note, written in her father's familiar handwriting. Mickey, I always knew you'd make it here. When you're in the sky, remember that you're never alone. You're carrying all of us with you. Fly high. Love, Dad. Her throat tightened as she read the words. She hadn't seen this note before. It must have been tucked into the manual without her realizing. Captain? Ryan asked gently. Michelle blinked back tears, her grip on the note tightening. It's from my dad, she said quietly. Ryan didn't press further, sensing the depth of the moment. Michelle carefully folded the note and tucked it back into the manual. Her resolve solidified. This flight wasn't just about proving herself. It was about honoring her father's dream. As the plane approached its destination, Michelle's voice came over the intercom once again, calm and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into London. On behalf of myself and the crew, thank you for flying with us today. In the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Passengers who had been skeptical or indifferent now watched Michelle with newfound respect. Even Linda seemed subdued, her earlier defiance replaced with quiet introspection. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, a ripple of applause filled the cabin. It wasn't unusual for a successful landing to be acknowledged, but this felt different, more personal. Michelle powered down the engines, her hands steady on the controls. She glanced at Ryan, who gave her a small, approving nod. Perfect landing, Captain, he said. Thank you, Michelle replied, her voice calm but resolute. The plane had come to a full stop at the gate, and the cabin crew busied themselves preparing for deboarding. Michelle remained in the cockpit for a moment, taking a deep breath. The smooth landing had been her final statement to any lingering doubts in the cabin. Still, the day's events lingered in her mind. Captain, Ryan said, breaking her thoughts. You want me to handle the walkout? I can greet the passengers if you'd prefer. No, Michelle replied firmly, standing up. I'll see them off. It's important. Ryan nodded, his respect evident. Understood. Michelle exited the cockpit and positioned herself near the cabin door as passengers began filing out. Most gave polite smiles or nods, a few murmuring their thanks. "Great flight, Captain," said the younger passenger who had defended her earlier. He lingered for a moment, offering a genuine smile. "You're an inspiration. People like you make the world better." "Thank you," Michelle said, her voice warm. "That means a lot." Linda and her husband were next. Linda avoided Michelle's gaze, clutching her handbag tightly. Her husband, however, paused, offering a sheepish smile. "Good flight, Captain," he said softly, nudging Linda. She hesitated, then looked up at Michelle, her face flushed. I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have." She stopped, struggling for the words. "You were right. I made assumptions I had no right to make. You're an exceptional pilot." Michelle held her gaze for a moment, letting the weight of the apology settle. Then she nodded, her tone even but kind. "Thank you for saying that. Growth is what matters." Linda's cheeks reddened further as she nodded and walked on. As the last of the passengers disembarked, Michelle leaned against the doorway, exhaling deeply. Dana approached her, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. "You okay, Captain?" Michelle smiled faintly. "I'm fine. Just glad it's over." "You handled that with so much grace," Dana said. "I've seen situations like this go sideways, but you turned it into something better." "It's not about me," Michelle said, shaking her head. "It's about the message it sends. If people can learn to see beyond their biases, maybe it'll make things easier for the next person in my position." Dana nodded, her respect evident. "Well, for what it's worth, you've got the entire crew behind you." Michelle made her way through Heathrow Airport, the towering glass windows reflecting the bustling activity outside. Her thoughts kept returning to the note from her father. It felt as though he had been with her through every moment of this flight, reminding her why she'd fought so hard to be here. As she reached the terminal's exit, her phone buzzed. A message from her sister, Monique, lit up the screen. "Monique, saw the news about your flight today. Dad would be so proud. Call me when you can." Michelle smiled softly, her fingers hovering over the screen. She started to reply but stopped as someone called her name. "Captain Carter?" She turned to see a middle-aged man in a tailored suit approaching her. His badge identified him as Robert Hayes, a senior executive for the airline. "Mr. Hayes," Michelle said, masking her surprise. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Hayes said, extending a hand. "I wanted to personally commend you on today's flight. I've been following your career for a while now, and you're an asset to this company." Michelle shook his hand, though her skepticism lingered. Executives rarely appeared unless there was a problem. "Thank you, sir. I'm just doing my job." "You're doing more than that," Hayes said. He hesitated, then added, "I also wanted to apologize for what I've heard about today's incident in the cabin. I'll be addressing it with the passengers directly." Michelle tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate that, but this isn't an isolated event. It's part of a bigger issue." Hayes nodded, his face serious. "I know, and that's why I'm here. We're planning a new initiative to address diversity and inclusion, starting with additional training for both crew and passengers. Your input would be invaluable." Michelle studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'd be happy to help, but it needs to be more than a statement. It has to lead to real change." "Agreed," Hayes said, his tone earnest. "I'll be in touch." Later that evening, Michelle sat in her hotel room overlooking the London skyline. The day's events played through her mind, but the note from her father anchored her thoughts. She pulled out the manual and unfolded the paper again, reading his words once more. "You're never alone. You're carrying all of us with you." For the first time that day, Michelle allowed herself to relax fully. She leaned back in her chair, the weight on her shoulders slightly lighter. This wasn't just about her success. It was about breaking barriers for others to follow. Does this maintain the balance of tension and resolution you're looking for? Let me know if you'd like me to continue to the final chapter. Michelle stood in the bustling terminal of Heathrow Airport the next morning, sipping her coffee as the first rays of sunlight spilled through the towering windows. Despite the early hour, she felt energized, her thoughts clear after a restful night. Today, she wasn't just a pilot. She was a symbol of change, both for herself and the generations who might follow in her footsteps. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Glancing at the screen, she saw it was her sister, Monique. "Morning, Mickey." Monique's voice chirped through the line. "I saw some posts online about your flight yesterday. People are talking about what happened. That woman's comments, your professionalism. It's inspiring." Michelle chuckled softly. "I'm glad some good came out of it. It wasn't easy, though." "I know," Monique said, her tone softening. "But you did what Dad always said, flew higher than anyone expected. He'd be so proud of you." Michelle's chest tightened. "Thanks, Monique. That means a lot." As she ended the call, a notification popped up on her phone. A message from Robert Hayes, the airline executive. "Hayes, our diversity initiative draft is ready. Would love your input. Let's talk when you're back." Michelle smiled faintly. She wasn't just a passenger on this journey anymore. She was helping chart the course. Later that day, Michelle boarded her return flight to Atlanta. As she walked through the cabin, the energy felt different. The crew greeted her with warmth, and passengers offered smiles and nods of acknowledgement. In the cockpit, Ryan was already seated, running through the pre-flight checklist. "Captain Carter," he said with a grin as she entered. "Ready for another smooth flight?" "Always," Michelle replied, sliding into her seat. As the plane ascended into the sky, the familiar hum of the engines filled the cockpit. Michelle's hands rested firmly on the controls, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon ahead. "Ryan," she said after a moment, "you ever think about how we're just tiny specks up here? But somehow, we're trusted with so much." Ryan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "I think about it all the time, but you make it look easy." Michelle smiled, her voice steady. "It's not about making it look easy. It's about proving over and over that we belong, that anyone who works hard and has the skill can belong." Ryan nodded, her words resonating deeply. As the plane began its descent into Atlanta, Michelle addressed the passengers over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Carter speaking. We're beginning our approach into Atlanta. I'd like to thank you for choosing to fly with us and for trusting us to get you here safely. On behalf of myself and the crew, we hope to see you again soon." In the cabin, a ripple of applause followed her announcement. Passengers exchanged smiles, and some leaned toward the windows to catch a glimpse of the city below. When the plane touched down, the applause grew louder. Michelle powered down the engines, her hands steady as always. Ryan turned to her, his smile wide. "Perfect landing, Captain." "Thanks," Michelle said, her voice calm but filled with quiet pride. As passengers disembarked, Michelle stood by the cockpit door, her professional demeanor intact. Among the passengers was a young black girl, no older than 10, holding her mother's hand. The girl's eyes widened when she saw Michelle in her uniform. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging her mother's sleeve. "She's the pilot." Michelle knelt slightly to meet the girl's gaze. "That's right, I'm the pilot." The girl grinned, her excitement palpable. "I want to fly planes too." Michelle's heart swelled. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small pin with the airline's logo, handing it to the girl. "Then you hold on to this. It's the first step toward the sky." The girl beamed, clutching the pin tightly. Her mother mouthed a quiet "thank you" to Michelle before they walked away. Later that evening, Michelle stood on her porch, the cool Atlanta breeze brushing against her face. She looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Fly higher than anyone expects." Michelle smiled, her resolve stronger than ever. She had flown high, and she wasn't done yet. The end. Did this conclusion deliver the impact and resolution you were looking for? Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to add or adjust.